Who are the Numen? Who are the Nox? Better yet, who are the Nightfolk? In Elden Ring, both Numen and Nightfolk are playable character races that can represent the Tarnished throughout the journey to become Elden Lord. However, the Numen and Nightfolk are among the most mysterious aspects of the whole game, with the Nightfolk often being overlooked as we simply aren't provided with much information about them. Of course, there is also the Nox, the underground dwellers of the Eternal Cities, a people we know to be at odds with the Greater Will, and choose to wait for their Lord of Night. In this video, I aim to discuss some of the key information we have on the Numen, Nox, and Nightfolk respectively. I also try to discern what each of these races could parallel or represent analogues for in history and mythology, as I believe a few to be connections to be too strong not to mention. We'll start with the Numen, as we arguably know the most about them in comparison to the Nox and Nightfolk. While players can choose to play as a male Numen, we only see female Numen in-game, such as Marika and the Black Knife Assassins. It's difficult to say whether or not all Numen are actually female considering the option to play as a male Numen, though that easily could be there to make sure the options for character creation are the same across each race. It's also not impossible, however, to think that there may be male Numen, we just don't simply see any. Aside from the fact that we still don't know if all Numen are female, they appear to parallel the Numenorians, or Dundanes, from the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Numenor is an island gifted to the Dundanes after a great battle, and are also gifted with extra long lives, as well as great wisdom. Moreover, they are described as being massive humanoid beings that have golden hair, which, on a surface level, does parallel what we know of the Numen race quite well. While we still don't know where the Numen originate from, another island could be considered another world by some, or by another world, perhaps it's meant to mean a place far from the lands between. I could also see this fitting well if they are truly based on the Numenorians, as the island of Numenor was sunk, and perhaps the Numen could be from another land or island that was destroyed or sunk by a greater power. Though I personally still think the Numen are likely descended from another world or realm or dimension or whatever you want to call it. I think it just fits with the current story as Marika, a Numen, was chosen to become the vessel for the Elden Ring and effectively become a god. And up to this point, we still don't know if outer gods are called thus because they exist outside the Lands Between, or outside the world the Lands Between resides in. It would be somewhat fitting for being seemingly inspired by H.P. Lovecraft to exist outside the dimension we are able to see in-game. And perhaps this is where the Numen come from as well. We are told they are supposed denizens of another world, and do seemingly have an innate ability to become and give birth to Empyreans, as can be seen when Marika becomes the vessel for the Elden Ring, and subsequently the progenitor of the Golden Order and Golden Lineage. The Numen could also be somewhat representative of the Tuatha De Danann, or the tribes or people of Danu. The Tuatha are a supernatural race of humanoid beings that come from the Otherworld, the realm of gods and the dead, which is also sometimes called Tir na Nog in Celtic mythology, which I've referenced a couple times in previous videos. The Tuatha are typically seen as more or less the good guys in Celtic mythology, and were foils to the Fomorians, which were akin to the giants of Norse mythology, representing chaotic forces of nature. As the name of Tribe of Danu implies, the Tuatha are the people of Danu, who is the primordial goddess that is alluded to throughout Celtic mythology, and is sometimes referred to as a triple goddess, though this has been somewhat disputed as the number 3 and triple goddesses were already a somewhat common motif in Celtic myths. However, Danu is also said to have a duality to her personality, with a motherly nurturing side, as well as a warring and malevolent side. Aside from the idea of her being a triple goddess, the dual nature of her character is very reminiscent of Marika and Radagon, especially as it seems Marika's drives and motivations differ from her other half, Radagon. So perhaps there's something there, as Elden Ring appears to have many sources of inspiration, and George R.R. Martin did help create the foundation of the world building, and it isn't too far-fetched to think there is a decent amount of Celtic mythology and history from the British Isles still remaining in the final product. The word Numen can also be variably translated to god, divine, or divinity, among others in Latin. Whether intentional or not, the choice of naming the Numen is interesting either way. If the inspiration is primarily from Tolkien's Numenorians, they are described as being the most noble race of men that eventually betrayed the ones who granted them their long lives and home. This could fit with what we know about the Numen, as they are from outside the lands between and are a long-lived race. Though we don't have any evidence to suggest the Numen betrayed a god or godly figures. Though if they are truly denizens from another world, why do they not still live in that other world? If the inspiration is primarily based on a race like the Tuatha, it would also fit with what we know about the Numen, as the Tuatha are essentially a demigod race of beings from the Celtic otherworld, with long-lasting lives. Moreover, the Tuatha are described as typically being tall with red or blonde hair and pale skin, which fits Marika's description, as well as Radagon's, though obviously we still don't know really who or what Radagon is, and could easily not be a Numen at all. The Tuatha are also really interesting as they are not all necessarily all that similar in appearance, as some accounts describe some of the Tuatha as being skilled magicians, where other portions were akin to fallen angels while others were straight up gods. This is again a nice parallel to Marika, as she is the only known Numen to achieve godhood, though Numen are still formidable combatants, as seen with the Black Knife assassins. Another quick connection is that Roman emperors were sometimes referred to as a Numen, as it was a way to identify the emperor as having been chosen by God, or to have nearly godlike status due to their position. Pretty neat. If you've been down some rabbit holes on Reddit or other forum sites, or just have watched videos discussing it, there's evidence to suggest that the Nox and Numen are the same, or at the very least are related to one another, with the Numen coming before the Nox or vice versa. Ragier describes the Black Knife assassins to have been scions of the Eternal City, though the Black Knife armor says they are rumored to be the Numen and have close ties with Marika. This of course also lends itself to other theories such as Marika being behind the Knight of the Black Knives, though I'm not really focusing on that one at the moment, and several other people have done incredible jobs covering that theory. Regardless, there is a connection between the Nox and Nightfolk that is yet to be fully revealed, and hopefully there are actually answers and we aren't being led on by the sweet nothings of Daddy Miyazaki. A quick note I had on this connection is the dichotomy of gold and silver, as silver is strongly associated with the Nox and Eternal Cities, whereas gold is associated with Marika and the Golden Order. I've read a few theories suggesting Marika is the creation of the Nox or Numen, and while I find this idea appealing, I think the importance of gold to Marika and the Greater Will doesn't seem to fit with the importance of silver to the Nox. Though perhaps this could be the divide between the Nox and Numen. The Nox are represented by the moon and cold silver, whereas the Numen are represented by Marika and thus the warmth of gold and light. Maybe the connection between the two groups is as simple as the Nox being those who refused the Greater Will, whereas the Numen are those that sided with the Greater Will and Marika. After all, the Nox are banished beneath the ground in their eternal cities. I think another connection that's a little less apparent is the combat styles of the Nox and Numen, as both groups of enemies have very quick and flowing attacks, particularly the Nox Swordstress and Night Maiden, whom both have attack styles similar to that of the Black Knife assassins. Coming back to the connections with the Tuatha De Danann, after a great battle, the Tuatha, or at least a great deal of them, as some may have also gone back to the other world, are driven to live underground. I absolutely loved learning about this, as it could parallel the relationship between the Nox and Numen, as the Tuatha were driven underground and effectively banished, just as the Nox were banished by the Greater Will. So perhaps the only difference is that the Numen remained above ground, whereas the Nox were forced to live under a false night sky. Nyx is also the name of a goddess from Greek mythology, later called Nox by the Romans. Nox or Nyx means night or darkness, and Nox was indeed the goddess of the night. Thus the naming of the people of the Eternal Cities is clearly intentional. Moreover, the Nox are shown to be driven to create life, and perhaps their own lord through the use of silver mimic tears, which also can be connected back to the goddess Nyx. Nyx was not only the goddess of the night, but could also create life and promote fertility. Furthermore, while being a goddess of the night, she also had manipulation over light, which again seems fitting with magic manipulation in the Eternal Cities that created the false stars we see in-game. The goddess Nyx, in general, was incredibly powerful, and was even feared by Zeus himself, who in this situation could be represented by Marika or the Greater Will, as gold and lightning are common motifs of the Greater Will. Perhaps the Nox are not just Numen who rejected the Greater Will, but people who worship a separate outer god, perhaps the outer god of the moon, which may have been seen as a greater affront than simply refusing the grace of the greater will. This also would solidify the relationship between Ranni and the Eternal Cities. The Nox also seem to have been attempting to recreate their own version of the Golden Order, that I will now coin as the Silver Order. So watch out, I own the trademark now. Anyway, we know the Nox sought to separate themselves entirely from the influence of the Greater Will, and sought to create their own lord similar to an Elden Lord. While they could have just been copying the Golden Order, the Nox also could have been setting the landscape for their outer god, to take the mantle as the primary source of power and influence over the lands between. At the very least, we know the Nox share a connection with the Numen, are at odds with the Greater Will, and have a desire to create life, as seen by the Silver Mimic Tears and Dragonkin soldiers. Another quick connection I wanted to mention was to that of Artemis and Apollo, as Artemis is the goddess of the moon as well, and is strongly associated with silver, which could have served as an influence for the Nox, similar to that of Nyx. Apollo is also often associated with the color gold, as he is the sun god, and this could again relate to the contrast of gold in the Golden Order and silver among the Nox people. Now, to start tying things together, I need to discuss the Nightfolk, which we easily know far less about than the Numens and Nox. With both the Numen and Nox, they can actually be encountered and fought in-game, as there are no Nightfolk enemies or NPCs in Elden Ring at all as far as I am aware. It's an interesting choice as they are such an intriguing race from both a visual standpoint as well as a lore standpoint. After all, they are called Nightfolk, and apparently bled silver long ago. Right away that sets alarm bells off for me, and it probably should for you as well, as their appearance not only suggests they are people who may have been nocturnal or worshipped the night or the moon, but the fact they once had silver blood immediately connects them to the Nox and Eternal Cities, as silver is kind of their whole thing. The fact we don't encounter any Nightfolk during our quest to become Elden Lord seems puzzling at first, though this could have been an intentional lore choice, as perhaps the Nightfolk don't really exist in large quantities, at least not separately from the Nox. I've seen many people alluding to the idea that the Nox and Nightfolk are one and the same, and honestly, I think there's some decent evidence to suggest that they are at least related, similar to the relationship between the Nox and Numen. My initial hypothesis on the connection between the Nightfolk and Nox was that the Nox actually used or even possibly enslaved the Nightfolk in order to further their attempts at creating their own Elden Lord. Though, as we don't know nearly anything about them, it's not exactly a concrete hypothesis. However, this could explain the in-game absence of the Nightfolk, as well as the abundance of silver in the Eternal Cities, as the Nightfolk had been their plentiful supply, as it was their blood, which may also help explain why silver mimic tears are typically seen in a more liquid-like state. Though, perhaps the relationship between the Nightfolk and Nox was not so malicious after all, and was maybe even an assimilation of the Nightfolk with the newly banished Numen. To explain, the Numen are seen to be more fair-skinned like Marika, whereas the Nox appear similar in appearance with their greyish skin. The Nox may only appear as they do because they are emerging of Numen and Nightfolk. Or perhaps I'm looking way too deep, and Nox and Nightfolk could actually be interchangeable terms for the same group of people, though that would admittedly discount the Numen connection. Going back to the Nyx connection, if From Software was inspired at all by the Greek/Roman goddess, it would be an interesting change to the mythos, as Nyx can create life and is symbolized by the moon and stars, and the silver blood of the Nightfolk may have been used as an attempt to replicate abilities similar to that of a god. Regardless, the Nightfolk are few in number and seemingly have a connection to the Eternal Cities through their once silver blood that is now maybe being used to create new forms of life. I also wonder if the Nox and Nightfolk being related could also explain one of the primary differences between the Nox and Numen other than skin color, that being the presence of males in the Eternal Cities. Again, we do not actually know for certain whether or not Marika comes from an all-female race, though there isn't direct evidence of there being a male Numen in-game, as their warriors are also women. However, in the Eternal Cities, Nox monks and priests can also be found, and they are male. Now, this could point to the Nox simply being separate from the Numen, but I personally think this helps confirm that the Nox are some form of Numen. The Black Knife Assassins are rumored to be scions of the Eternal Cities, and Numen runes can be found near one of the Eternal Cities, again solidifying the connection between the two. Moreover, we also know that the Numen are long-lived but seldom born, and this could be a factor of them possibly being an all-female race, as we don't really know how they reproduce. Maybe, when many of the Numen were banished underground, they encountered the Nightfolk, and through combined efforts, built the Eternal Cities and crafted a false night sky. While I don't have an explanation as to why the Nightfolk would have been underground, I don't really find it to be a far-fetched idea, as whole civilizations are buried beneath the lands between. The Numen and Nightfolk coming into contact to form the Nox would explain their appearance that is much more akin to that of the Nightfolk than Numen, as well as the Nox's fascination with silver mimic tears. I also have a sneaking suspicion that the covering of female Nox through clothing such as the Nox swordstress crown could be representative of a change that occurred in Nox culture as a result of being at least a primarily female race that came in contact with a race that was more patriarchal. While entirely speculation, I wonder if the Numen who were banished underground lived under a more matriarchal system, whereas the Nightfolk embodies a more patriarchal system. If there's any truth to this, I think it could help explain as to why there are still religious female figures and warriors among the Nox, though they have their eyes covered, whereas the male Nox do not cover their eyes, and are capable of earning the title of priest among the Nox, while females don't seemingly earn that high a title. It is not unheard of for women to have to cover parts of their body in certain cultures and religions, and perhaps the Nox are the female Numen who were strong-armed by the Nightfolk. The Nox being a product of the Numen and Nightfolk assimilating with one another can also help illuminate the source of their worship of the night, moon, and stars. The Nightfolk, as their name implies, are people of the night and bled silver, and perhaps the Numen were not aware of the power of silver, or the possible outer god of the night or moon. With Marika so connected to gold, I find it poetic to think that the Numen banished underground, perhaps by Marika through instruction from the Greater Will, would seek out silver as their source of power, a color and substance often viewed as the inverse of gold. Whether or not Marika was instrumental in banishing the Nox, Marika sided with the Greater Will, and the Nox wished to undermine this relationship, which I believe to be a detail that can point toward a link between the Nox and Marika. After all, the Nox are said to have invoked the ire of the Greater Will long ago, and perhaps this ire was not following in Marika's footsteps, and rather than slaying them, they were banished underground, as Marika perhaps did not want her entire race to perish, regardless of their choice to reject the Greater Will. This could be fitting with Marika's supposed connection to the Knight of the Black Knives as well, as Marika may have been playing the long con and actually sought to assist her banished people. I also find this to match up with the Nox trying to create their own Silver Order, especially if you believe Marika orchestrated Godwyn's assassination, as it could arguably have laid the groundwork for another Elden Lord to rise from the Eternal Cities, as the Nox are of the same stock as Marika, and were informed on how to go about creating their own Silver Order and Lord of Night. Though, like I say often, there's a great deal of speculation here, but I just love speculating on this stuff. There's just so many directions and paths one could take when trying to elucidate nearly any topic in this game. Sorry if this one was a bit more all over the place than some of my other videos, but I am just really fascinated by the possible connections between the Numen, Nox, and Nightfolk, and I really feel like I'm onto something with the Nightfolk and Nox being related, and how that eventually connects back to the Numen like Marika. I certainly don't think I have all the answers, nor do I really think From Software has given us all the answers, but I think some of the connections I presented between the three races are fairly plausible, especially there being some sort of close relationship between the Nox and Nightfolk. I was also fascinated learning about the Tuatha De Danann and Tolkien's Dunedains, and the parallels between those fictional races and the fictional race of the Numen. Though, I think I've rambled long enough at this point, so I'm gonna hop off and let you process all these big brain ideas I've left you with. But until next time, I've been Noctugal. Peace out.